In this video, I'll be covering some principles about team shots. For those who are new to the concept, the term team shots simply stands for multiple players teaming up and shooting one enemy. Throughout this video, I'll extend the concept of team shots to cover the broader topic of working as a team, since both are so closely related. A week or so ago, I saw a video from another YouTuber by the name Ascendant Nomad talking about what makes movement, in his words, the biggest skill gap between good and great players. I agree with his point, and just as he mentioned, the skill ceiling in Destiny 2 is not all that high, especially for gunplay. So what can you do to separate yourself and your team from the slog of mid-level Crucible? Well, just as movement separates good players from bad players, team shots separate good teams from bad teams. A team of average players who work together to get team shots will almost always beat a team of great players who don't play together at all. Unfortunately, good team skills are something I believe is missing for many Destiny players, even at fairly high levels of play. First, I'd like to cover the biggest misconception about team shots I've read and heard. You need a dedicated fire team. You don't. In fact, somewhat counterintuitively, team shotting really has very little to do with a team. The principles of team shooting are found mostly at the individual level and can be applied to pretty much any Crucible playlist, fireteam or not, except maybe Rumble for obvious reasons. This is why the best players can team up with pretty much anyone and still seem to be playing together. So, as you listen to this video, some explanations might not seem related to team shots, but realize that it's the overall mentality presented which allows any player to perform well with any team. So now, let's move on to the tips. This one is simple. Good players know where the enemies are at all times, but great players know where everyone is at all times. Obviously, you don't need to know the exact position of each teammate, but you want a sense for where your teammates are and to some degree what they are doing. This ability is especially important for the following topics in the video. This is also a small point, but it leads into something greater. Obviously, the most basic principle of team shooting is playing in a way which allows you to find 2v1s against your enemy. To do this, you want to avoid situations where you are isolated and either can't help your team or get help from your team. But often, when new players are told to play with their team, they end up just following teammates around mindlessly trying to shoot people with them. Their intentions are good, but their execution is bad. Even though there are many situations where you might want to hug your teammates, like a close range 2v1 for example, playing that close together is usually a bad idea, and that's for a few reasons. Notably, you're vulnerable to grenades, abilities, and supers. However, the most important point is that you lose map control. Have you ever played a match where it felt like people were peeking you from every angle and you couldn't push anything without being shot from two different directions? That's good enemy map control. Likewise, you've probably played matches where you were given acres of space and you never felt pressured by an enemy's presence. That's good map control from your team, whether you realized it or not. Map control is also important when heavy ammo is up for grabs, since you want to control the heavy ammo when it comes time to take it. Gaining map control in Destiny is a continuous process involving expanding to take space and then collapsing to corner enemies. Throughout this process, you want to avoid overextending and losing the ability to work with your teammates. This can be tough to recognize because, unlike in other FPS games, map control in Destiny is extremely dynamic. The best teams expand and collapse incredibly quickly, to the point I hesitate to even call it map control. Either way, the entire concept of team movement is, unfortunately, outside of the scope of this video, but for now, realize that if your team is permanently collapsed, meaning you don't undergo the expansion stage, you aren't going to be putting adequate pressure on the enemy team. Likewise, teams that stay expanded and never collapse won't capitalize on picks or take advantage of team shots. To demonstrate this cycle of expansion and collapse, I'll show you a top-down example on Javelin 4. Credit to Reddit user R3LIKT for this map. Just note this is a simple example to show the concept, not an exhaustive explanation of movement and map control. So, let's say this is survival. There are 3 enemies shown as red circles, you are the green circle, with both of your teammates being blue circles. The round has just begun, and naturally, your teammates have started to expand and probe for picks. This is what your view would look like. Now suppose teammate 1 gets a kill on enemy 1. What's your next move? Well, if I saw this situation unfolding, my first intuition would be to exploit the space which has been created and collapse on the final 2 players. How would I do that? Well, that actually depends on what your teammates do. If teammate 1 comes with me, I would recognize that we can team shot enemy 2, so I would play hyper aggressive to get that kill before enemy 1 respawns. But if teammate 1 chooses to wrap around with teammate 2, I'll still begin to collapse, but slower, and that's for a few reasons. First off, I'm alone. The worst thing that can happen to me right now is getting picked off by enemy 2, so I need to be cautious. Furthermore, if I go too far, enemy 3 might wrap back and collapse on me, putting me in a 1v2, which I also don't want. So, if I don't want to get picked off, why should I bother pushing at all? Well, without my involvement, my 2 teammates and the enemies are in a 2v2, and I want to push the odds in the favor of my team to make this a 3v2, just in a way that ensures I won't die. So my primary purpose is to engage with enemy 2 so that my teammates can team shot enemy 3. Here, I don't actually have to fight. My presence is most needed to distract enemy 2 and keep him from fighting my other teammates. If he does decide to fight my teammates at the top of the map, I'll have an easy flank on him. This is an especially important phase in many fights. If you could recognize that your teammates may soon be able to help you, play your life. This fight is a 1v1 right now, but once enemy 3 is killed, which is likely considering it's a 2v1, you are now all free to collapse on enemy 2. Once enemy 2 is dead, the cycle repeats, and your team should begin to expand to control more of the map and get picks. This might not seem like it at first, but notice how the decisions shown here are all individual. No comms needed, no fireteam required. Each player is doing their own thing, but as long as they follow the correct flow, it all works out. I think the problem of passivity stems from players not realizing that just because they aren't getting a bunch of kills doesn't mean that they aren't helping their team. It's easy to correlate your kills or KD to your contribution in a game. After all, the post-match screen basically says just that. So when players get matched against great opponents, they curl up into their shell and start playing passively to save their stats. Even though their KD is better and they feel like they've gotten more kills, they aren't actually helping their team. I'll summarize my thoughts on passivity with this. Generally, if you aren't actively engaging someone or moving around to expand with your team, you're not helping at all. And in 3v3 game modes like Trials and Survival, a third of your team not contributing is a big problem. Not only will the other players on the team struggle to find map control and optimal positions, but they will constantly be fighting at a player deficit. So, if you notice during your gameplay that you are consistently sitting and waiting for enemies to enter your reticle, you're almost certainly doing something wrong. Try to play around your team, sometimes spearheading the aggression, other times following your teammates into fights. My previous point on passivity is also why I dislike the whole concept of big flanks, a term for taking the longest route to wrap around the entire map and flank the enemy team. Sure, the idea of being behind the enemy sounds great, but how are you helping your team while you're running around the uncontested half of the map? If the enemy team decides to push while you're flanking, they have a clear player advantage over your team. Beyond just being a bad idea, big flanks aren't something you're really going to see within high-level matches simply because the teams will not give anyone the time or space to perform that kind of maneuver. A small flank is fine, but if you want to play with your team, I would avoid the big flank. Another important point of team shooting is playing off your teammates' peaks. This is where you really need a good grasp on what your teammates are doing. So again, let's cover this in a hypothetical situation. Here, you only have one teammate and one enemy. Let's say you engage with the enemy. Your shots are off and you take some damage, so you duck behind cover and wait for regen. Knowing this, the enemy starts pushing your location, but before they can get to you, your teammate enters a fight with them. A lot of newer players who still don't fully grasp team shooting would keep sitting here and wait for regen. However, this is the perfect opportunity to team shot by playing off your teammate's peaks. Since your teammate is fighting the enemy, you know they won't be looking at you. Therefore, you should be able to get away with peeking the enemy without even being shot. And, once you peek, if the enemy does turn his attention towards you, all you have to do is back away into cover and let your teammate finish the fight. The enemy can only fight one person at a time, so bait his shots, distract him, shoot him, just make sure you do anything which keeps this fight from being a 1v1. So, with this video, I hope I've explained why team shots and team play are much more of an individual mentality than a team one. If you follow these ideas and start practicing them, I'm sure you will fit better into almost every team, regardless of if you played with them before or not. Now, sometimes there will be people who don't follow the general rules of team play. Don't get discouraged by this. Keep practicing the right methods, and when you queue with good players who also understand these ideas, the results will be worth it. So, that's all I have for this video. I'd like to thank all of my subscribers. I think I got 32 just from the last video, which is awesome, so thank you to everyone for the support. As always, I'm open to more suggestions on future videos.